Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Christine Dixon of The Ordinary Sacred, and I today want to read a passage to you from Internal Family Systems Skills Training Manual by Frank Anderson, Martha Sweezy, and Richard Schwartz. Three of the best writers of IFS books, by the way. And this one is really, really great because it's a sample IFS session that is pretty complete. It illustrates the process of befriending a protector, going to the exile, witnessing it, reparenting it, retrieving it, and unburdening it. So it illustrates the whole process, and it also is a protective part that causes a physical somatic symptom in the body. That's very repetitive. Physical, somatic, in the body, all mean the same thing. So I hope you really appreciate this example. And I'll just read it directly and, maybe give my 2 cents here and there. So the client's name is Jay, and he comes in to the session with his IFS therapist and says, I just don't feel anything. So the therapist says, say more. And Jay goes on, well, when you or anyone else for that matter, including my wife or my kids, ask me what I'm feeling, I just don't know how to respond. I don't seem to feel things the way that most people do. So the therapist says, do you want to explore this? So in asking that question, the therapist is really getting permission from the protectors. Is it okay, to go toward this, to get curious about it? And Jay says yes. And the therapist says, would it be okay to close your eyes? And Jay says yes. And the therapist says, good. Now notice any thoughts, feelings, or physical sensations that come up. This is something that I do with the weekly IFS support group we do at the beginning of every session, just making that while you turn and going inside and checking for what I call your pets. Any physical sensations that you notice, any emotional energy, and any thoughts, kind of opinions, words, expressions, things that are coming out about past, present, or future. These are going to be indications of parts. So that's how the therapist starts the session, which I think is great. And Jay says, okay. And then after a few seconds, Jay opens his eyes and says, I'm aware of chest pains. Okay, so now they have found a part through just observing the body, the mind, and emotions. And Jay finds these chest pains in his body. So now they're going to focus on that. The therapist says, is it okay to focus on those to see what we can learn? Again, getting permission from the system, each step of the way. Is it okay to go there? Jay says, yes, I've had these chest pains for years. That's nothing new. I've been to several doctors and they keep saying nothing's wrong. Once I even thought I was having a heart attack. I called an ambulance and I went to the ER and everything, and still nothing was wrong with me. So there's a note here that says Jay is completely unaware of any physiological reason for his pain, which speaks to the high level of protection that somatizing often represents. So this is can be a really common thing where people have chronic pain, this mind-body pain, and it is very physical. We are genuine, because I've had this many kinds of symptoms like this. It is very physical. For example, I've had migraines, kind of jaw TMJ type pain, chronic fatigue syndromes, fibromyalgia, just a lot of achiness, back pain, IBS, chest pain, all kinds of things. And when you go to the doctor and they run tests and they're just like, we're not finding anything, it's often an indication that it may be a part who is using your body. And we'll see why this part is using Jay's body. So the therapist says, would it be okay to go back inside and be curious about the chest pain? I believe all physical sensations hold important information for us. I love that. Again, asking for permission and being really clear that we want to get curious about it because there may be parts who feel afraid of it, judgmental of it, want to fix it, right? And just seeing like if basically are you willing to give a little space to just be openly curious about this pain? And I love that the therapist says, all physical sensation holds important information for us. That I've absolutely found that to be true. If you watch my videos about my own exploration of many different kinds of physical pain in my body, sometimes it's entirely physical. There's a entirely physical cause. Other times it's completely trauma-based or a part trying to distract me for various reasons, right? Other times there's a combination of the two. But when I go inside and can get curious without trying to think up answers or fix it or kind of be anxious about it, if those parts give space, that my body and the parts will give me direct insight about what the root is. It's always very, very fruitful to get curious about it. Okay, so now they're going to flesh it out. Jay says, okay, I'll try to be curious. And after a few moments, he continues and says, I saw myself as a boy. He must be 8 years old. So a part is beginning to show Jay about his experiences. So it sounds like he's kind of really being ushered in really quickly to the exile, to witness this experience when he was 8. The therapist asks, what did you see? And Jay says, it's the day that my grandfather died. And the therapist, paying attention to Jay's body language, says, you look puzzled. And Jay says, yes, I am. So the therapist asks, are you open to seeing more? She's kind of like checking for self-energy here. Jay says yes, and then he closes his eyes again, and his tears start to well up. And Jay continues and says, Grandpa was very important to me. My father left when I was 4 years old, so he was basically my dad. And the therapist says, is the chest pain connected? Jay says, yes, but I don't know how. The therapist says, are you open to hearing more? And Jay says, yes, I'm really curious now. So yeah, I would tell Jay, ooh, do you want to go in directly and ask? Because you don't ever have to guess in IFS. You don't have to think up anything or guess about it. You can go in directly and ask the chest pain, how you're showing me this. I know you're showing me this for a reason. Can you tell me why? And it sounds like Jay's in self-energy. He's feeling really curious. So the therapist says, so send your curiosity directly to the chest pain and ask what it wants you to know. I love this open-ended question. This is one of the best to me because it's not leading and directing. It's really handing the baton to the part to say, I'm just open and willing to receive anything you want me to know. And so Jay says, this sounds strange, but I'm getting that the chest pain helps me to not have feelings. So this is really clear now that the chest pain is a protective part and that it's afraid that if it didn't give him chest pain, then he would feel these really intense emotional feelings, grief around losing his grandfather, it seems like. And so it's letting him know it's good intention. Again, this is not always the case, so you always want to go in and ask parts directly, but this can be very common, that especially chronic physical pain acts as a distraction for more emotional pain that a part feels like you cannot handle. Okay, so they've kind of begun befriending this protective chest pain. And the therapist says, ask it to say more about why it's important to not have feelings. I like how the therapist asked this question. It really is another way of asking, what is this part afraid would happen if it let you have feelings, right? If it didn't distract you from feelings. And Jay says, I am seeing this fort that I made in my bedroom. It was a blanket cave under a couple of chairs, and I used to go in there when I was upset. The therapist asks, does this make sense to you? And Jay says, yes, totally. I like this because it might not make sense to the therapist, right? But it makes sense to Jay. Like this connection, this experience of I have to hide my emotion under a blanket fort, right? But it doesn't matter if it makes sense, to anyone else, just to the person who's experiencing it and their self. Okay, so the therapist says, let him know that you are getting the connection, like that you're getting what he's trying to show you and explain to you. I also want to make a point here that when you ask a part, what do you want me to know? A lot of times we think of it like, oh, it's going to tell me in words. But that's not always the experience. Sometimes there are very verbal, articulate parts, but a lot of times parts are very young and they will show you through memories, sometimes snippets, sometimes just images, symbols, feeling in your body, a posture. It's almost like these puzzle pieces that they're giving you. And when yourself gets it, what the message they're trying to send to you, you feel clarity about it. Like when he asked, are you getting this? What does this make sense to you? The therapist asked, and Jay says, oh, yes, totally. Right? He's like, yes, I get what they're trying to communicate to me by just showing me this blanket fort that I would sit in when I was emotional. All right. So now Jay says, I grew up in a family that was not into feelings. When Grandpa died, my mother had a birthday party for my older brother the next day. She baked a cake, wrapped the presents, and set the table. And her attitude was, the show must go on. Okay, so really what Jay's doing now is he's witnessing the environment in which this 8-year-old was, right? And kind of this legacy burden, right? That he's witnessing his mother just completely shut down. This was likely her father or father-in-law, shut down her emotions completely and just went forward, right? This would be called, Derek Scott talks a lot about our grieving parts. This would be called kind of our restoration cluster of parts. It's like, just keep going with life. Don't let the grief come up. Likely her own system was taught that and felt like, I can't handle the grief. I have to be a mother, be strong, right? And this is what Jay is witnessing. So it says, Jay is now noticing the extremity of the boy's experience, and he is speaking in first person, indicating that he sees this experience from the perspective of the boy. Even so, this is not what we call a blended experience because the boy feels that Jay is also there with him. He is confidently showing Jay's self about the experience. So a lot of people in my IFS practitioner group will ask about this. Like, should I stop the person? Now they're blended with the exile. Sometimes you can ask them, is this okay with you? This experience, or is it okay for you to experience this if there's emotion or they're witnessing something? But it's actually, sometimes I'll call it conscious blending because it's really actually valuable to go back there and experience what it was like for that young part of you back in that scene so that your current self can really get it. Because often other parts, in the system will minimize it. They'll say, oh, it wasn't that bad. They were just doing the best they could. They'll kind of make excuses or minimize. And so to really get not what it would have been like as an adult back there, but what it would have been like for an 8-year-old boy, right? It's really important to kind of put ourselves back in their shoes. Okay, so the therapist says, what was that like for him? And Jay says, it was confusing. I knew it was crazy to have a party right after Grandpa died. I felt like the world had ended. My brother was miserable. I'm getting that the chest pain helped me get through that time, so I did not have to feel those feelings. It was a big distraction. So in this case, for Jay, the chest pain is a part. Technically, we would consider the chest pain a protective part of the boy. Okay, this is a can be a confusing caveat, but that they're pointing out here, but I'll say it. So technically, the chest pain would be considered a protective part of the boy because it's a subpart. It's a part of a part. But because the boy and Jay's self are in such sync, we can effectively address the chest pain as simply a part. So if this confuses you, just don't worry about it. It's like nesting dolls. Parts can have parts, but you can still just treat them all as parts of yourself or of the client if you're working with a client. Okay. The therapist says, how do you feel toward the chest pain now? Again, checking for self-energy. And Jay says, I appreciate what it did for me. It really likes that I'm getting this, right? Because, if you've had kind of unexplained chest pain and you've gone to the ER, likely you have really fearful parts, understandably, around it. And we're probably are like, just why can't this go away? What is wrong with me? So this chest pain has probably not gotten a lot of appreciation in the system. So it's liking that. So the therapist asks, I'm wondering if the chest pain would be interested in not having to work so hard. So this is, an invitation to try something new. Jay says, I do sense that it's exhausted. This is often very true of our protective parts. And the therapist says, if it will let us help the boy with those feelings, we can get him out of the past. And Jay says, the boy wants that. So it sounds like Jay is simultaneously, in touch with the boy and the chest pain, simultaneously. And the therapist says, so let's ask the chest pain if it will let you help the boy. So we're always, getting permission because this chest pain has protected this boy and his intense emotions for a really long time. We definitely don't want to steamroll over it. It will likely ramp up, have backlash if we don't get permission. But Jay says, okay. So it's giving permission, and Jay says, I can see him in the fort in my bedroom, the boy. And the therapist says, how do you feel toward him? Again, checking for self-energy toward the exile. And Jay says, I feel a lot of love for him right now. Definitely a indication of self-energy. The therapist asks, is he able to receive your love? This is a good question because you want to check if the client's in self-energy, or if you're in self-energy, but also how is the part responding to that? Are they able to receive it or connect? And sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. And Jay says, yes, he's looking up at me and smiling. And the therapist says, great. What does he want you to know? So again, just this open-ended question, what do you want me to know? And Jay says, he seems really sad. So it sounds like, again, the boy's not telling him or showing him anything except maybe emotionally, right? Really getting his sadness, which makes sense. And the therapist says, again, is this level of feeling okay for you? Again, really checking with the system. I like this example because the therapist is constantly getting permission, checking, for self-energy. And that's, you want to do that every step of the way. And kind of checking to see if Jay's protectors are up and how they're feeling about this level of feeling, because the chest pain had to come in to stop this level of feeling, right? So you want to check, are you okay with feeling this? And Jay says, it is a bit intense. Okay, so they are concerned. So the therapist says, okay, let the boy know that we are here to help him with his sadness and ask him to share with you just a little at a time so that you don't get overwhelmed. And it's really so the other parts don't get overwhelmed, but because the self won't really get overwhelmed by it, but so that the protective parts don't feel like they have to jump back in. Um, all parts have the capability of kind of titrating what they show us, especially emotional energy. And so just asking that part to do that, negotiating it. And Jay says he is okay with that. So the therapist is good. Just be with him and let him share what he wants you to know. So Jay sits quietly for several minutes and tears stream down his face as he witnesses the boy's grief. This is so powerful. It seems very simple. But again, these protective parts that are young have come in to distract and make sure that Jay does not feel the grief of this boy. And the trauma was really that the boy was alone in his grief, right? He didn't have his mother or anyone else to help him process, allow his grief, that wasn't afraid of his grief. So he had to exile his grief, right? So the reason why this is such a redemptive experience, a healing experience, is because now he's not alone in his grief. His adult self is there with him, holding him, attuning with him. He's not alone, and he can feel it now. Jay says, uh, he is so sad. He is sad about my father leaving. He's sad about my grandpa dying. He's sad that mom couldn't handle his feelings. And the therapist says, does that make sense to you? And Jay says, totally. The therapist asks, is there anything else he wants to share? Again, this is such a good question to ask, keep asking during this witnessing phase. Is there anything else they want you to know? Is there anything else they want to share? And just keep asking it until they say, no, that's it, right? And it can, it can be a minute or a year that they want to keep showing you more. And it's very valuable. Everything they want to show you is important. But Jay says, I think that's it. There's a note that says, when a client uses the word think, be aware that a thinking part may have stepped in. So we ask him to ask the part directly for an answer. So the therapist says, ask him. And Jay says, he says the chest pain started when Grandpa died because that's when I was really alone. No father, no mother, and now no grandpa. Yeah, makes sense. And the therapist says, wow, what does he need from you? Jay says, just this. Often that is the case. There are these parts that have held these intense emotions by themselves and were relegated to the dungeon of our consciousness, right? Exiled. And they just want to not be alone, be held, be allowed to feel. So, I mean, that's everything. So the therapist is just silent for a while and lets Jay sit with this 8-year-old. And then the therapist says, is he ready to leave that time? He can come to the present with you or go somewhere else that's safe. Jay says he wants to be with me. So the therapist says, okay, are you in the bedroom with him? And Jay says, yes, I am picking him up. And the therapist says, great, bring him to the present. So this is the retrieval stage. They check to see if the part wants to be retrieved. It seemed to want to be retrieved. So, and it can go to a safe place, a place in the imagination, or just in the present. Sometimes parts want to just come into our heart, that kind of thing. And it looks like, okay, so Jay starts frowning, and the therapist noticed this and says, is something happening? And Jay says, yes, I think some other part doesn't want me to take him. So the therapist says, ask why. We always want to respect any part that has resistance or concern. Jay says, I used to get silent a lot when I was a kid. It feels like that part. And the therapist says, would the silent part like to come with you too? Jay says, yes. And therapist says, great, bring it up to the present with the boy, but ask the silent part to give you a few more moments with the boy, and then we can help him afterward. There's a note here that says the silent part also protects the boy. So often when there's this really extreme part and that holds really big emotion in the past, there can sometimes be a whole army of protectors that protect them, right? So there's the chest pain to try to distract, and then there's this part that kind of just shuts him down, it sounds like, to just be quiet, don't say anything, don't do anything. And so they both protect this same exile, and they got permission from the chest pain, but now this other one's coming up and like, wait a minute. And so, but that one is willing to come back with them and watch. Okay, one more page. We're almost there. So Jay says, it's hesitant but willing. So parts can totally be hesitant and skeptical as long as they're willing. That's enough permission. The therapist says, great. It can check in with the boy very soon. So kind of reassuring it. Jay says, the boy is holding on to me so tightly now. The therapist says, is that okay with you? Again, checking for self-energy. Because if he has other protective parts, he might be like, oh, he's clingy, he's annoying, right? You want to make sure that he's not blended with any parts that are not self. But he says, yes, it's excellent. It feels great to both of us. He says, we are now in my daughter's bedroom in my current house. That's where he seems to want to be. Yeah, parts will tell you exactly what they want. Therapist says, is that okay with you? He nods. Says, now ask him if he has shown you everything he needs you to know about this experience. I like this therapist because it just keep asking, even after retrieval, is there anything else, he wants you to know? And I mean, even after they're fully unburdened and you're checking in with them, they may have other things they want you to know. And he says yes, that he's finished. And the therapist says, is he ready to let go of his burdens? So once a part has been witnessed and reparented and retrieved, then we can do an unburdening. Jay says yes, he would like to release his burdens, and the therapist says, okay, have him check in and around his body for all the thoughts, feelings, and sensations that he is ready to let go of. He can do this in any way he chooses. And there's a note here I like. This says the exiled part is invited to make all the decisions. Yes, yes. Sometimes, so this is how I usually do it too, is I will just leave it open, let the part, show me where your burdens are, show me what they are, how do you want to release them? If they're confused and they're like, I don't have any ideas, I don't know, we might offer a menu of, it could be to one of the elements, water, fire, air, earth, light. And sometimes they'll say, oh yeah, I want to put it in a fire, or I want to wash it in a waterfall or something like that. But it can be lots of other things. I've had, parts that want to bulldoze something, they want to shoot it into space, or they have all kinds of creative ideas. So Jay says he wants to burn it in a bonfire. That's a very common one. I have several parts who've done that. The therapist says, okay, let me know when he's done. And it's funny. So many people ask me, how long does this unburdening step take? And it really is often one of the quicker steps. It doesn't take that long. And yet it's very powerful. And again, it's inside, kind of in the mind's eye, right? But it's really memorable that they are releasing these burdens and putting them in the fire and watching them burn. And you can even feel in your body, if you're doing it yourself, or the client might feel in their body a physical lightening of their body, like these burdens are being taken off of them. But it's, it can be anywhere from 10 seconds to a couple minutes or something. But as long as it takes, right? The therapist just says, let me know when you're done, no rush at all. And then the therapist, oh, Jay says, it's so freeing. Yeah. And the therapist says, wonderful. How is he doing? Jay says, he's so happy. He wants to play. This is very often the response. Once the burdens are released, there's a lightness, there's a playfulness, there's energy. Often parts will run and jump and explore and dance and sing, and it's just wonderful. So the therapist says, now let's check with the chest pain and the silent part and anyone else who has been protecting him. Just invite them all in and have them take a look and see how he's doing. Jay says they're shocked at how happy he looks right now, right? Because what they've always known is that he held sadness and grief, right? But just in being able to fully express it without judgment and to feel it, he's been able to unload it. So the therapist says, do they get that he is safe with you now? They say yes. He says, good. What do they need from you? Jay says, strangely, the chest pain wants to do something physical, like ride a bike. That's often very common, actually. And the silent part wants to meditate. Nice. Okay, so they're taking on new, valuable, supportive jobs in the system. They're no longer desperate, feeling urgent. They're just, chilling and supporting the system. And the therapist says, sounds nice. Is that okay with you? He says, yes. He said, then they should do just that. Will you take care of the boy until we meet again next week by briefly checking in with him daily? And Jay says, definitely. I always emphasize to clients, it doesn't have to be long. Like the very little that you'll check in with a part each day is much more valuable, the consistency of it, than the length of it. So even if you just, while you brush your teeth, you bring the exile to mind and say, hey, how are you doing? Or observe how they're doing, seriously, for 5 seconds, that's going to be really valuable. And if there are parts that block you, or if you're a therapist or coach, the client, you just get curious about what parts are blocking the way and why. And then I'll just read this last note. It says, as we see, the distraction of somatic symptoms has protected Jay from emotional pain for many years. Effective as it can be to substitute one kind of pain for another in the short run, handling emotional pain in this way is clearly a very young solution. Physical pain is puzzling, alarming, and exhausting, and does not extinguish the background noise of the emotional pain, right? You often go into these protective parts and you ask them, oh, how is it working for you? And they're like, it's not. I work so hard. And that emotional pain still comes up, and it's because the protectors themselves are very young, and they're doing the only thing that helped them back then because they didn't have any kind of adult strong support. And so that's what we're offering them now, right? There actually is one inside who can be with that emotional pain so that you don't have to do this job anymore. So it says protector actions are usually young in this way. They start very young and they are cognitively young, and they continue to reference the often severely limiting circumstances of childhood. So they really need this update that the person has an adult self now, has different capacities, and just this understanding of multiplicity, that the self can go back and be with those parts that were alone in their pain, so they don't have to be alone in it anymore. And when that emotional pain is no longer threatening the system, the physical distraction does not need to be there anymore. That part can just naturally drop that job. And it's amazing, if you're familiar, last note I'll say here, with like John Sarno's work and, mind, body, pain. This was something that he discovered. He was a medical doctor and worked with people who had back pain and knee pain and things like that. And even, lots of people would have a structural issue on an MRI or an X-ray and feel no pain. And some people would have no structural issue or a structural issue and have a lot of pain. And he really made this discovery that time and time again, this physical pain was distracting the person from deep emotional pain that they felt like they couldn't feel. And that the way to allow the physical pain to not have to distract anymore was to convince it that they were capable of going toward the emotional pain, of feeling it, of giving it loving attention. And then the physical pain didn't have to do that distracting job anymore. It really is amazing. And I've had that experience with myself many times. Just one example, I had this intense jaw pain. When I went into the jaw and I said, "What do you want me to know?" It was like, it's just bracing, bracing, bracing really tight. And I said, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't brace like that? And it showed me this image of like, it's holding back the floodwaters of panic and terror. So it was protecting a young part of me that felt panic and terror. And once I was able to say, "Can you just let me be with the panic?" The panicked one, even, I'll set a timer, I'll be with that one for 90 seconds, and then you can come and hold it back again, but kind of negotiating so that part could gain evidence that it wouldn't overwhelm the system, that I could handle it and all of that. And eventually, with enough evidence, it just started softening, and the pain completely went away. So again, that may or may not be true for your pain. I encourage you to go directly in and ask any parts that are producing any kind of physical symptom for you. There's all kinds of reasons that parts will do that. All right, I hope you enjoyed that. I love the completeness of that. If you have any questions or any comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments below.